which you, my God, have created.
Welcome, everyone. I'm glad you're going to be with us for a bit of a talk on one of my favorite subjects, the Beguines of the medieval ages. I'm Laura Swan. I'm a Benedictine from St. Placid Priory in the Pacific Northwest. We're located about an hour south of Seattle, and we are a daughter house from St. Ben's in St. Joseph, Minnesota, St. John's, Collegeville, so that area. And so we trace our roots back to Bavaria and Mother Benedict who came over to begin monastic life in North America. So she's the first, the Swiss come later. Wanted to talk to this morning about the Beguines, which was a movement in early medieval times. The word Beguine is not about the Cole Porter song about a river. What is it called? The Beguine. Instead, it was initially an insult as this movement erupted, where it meant a two-faced liar or a mumbler. And the insult was because everyone knew, quote unquote, that women were not intelligent, were not capable of understanding scripture, were not capable of understanding theology, and here they were out there talking and teaching and preaching, and so therefore they were a two-faced liar or they were a mumbler, but very quickly it became a compliment because of the work they were doing for the people in their area. So I want to backtrack a little bit to about the year 1000. Everyone knew in Europe that Jesus was going to return in the year 1000, and he didn't. And so conversation quickly erupted about what happened. Why didn't he come? He was supposed to come. They had a way of figuring out in Scripture exactly what year he was going to come back, and he didn't. And conversation began not just in the higher reaches of the church, but down at the market where you bought your fish and bought your bread. People were talking to each other and wondering, and they were actually growing quite concerned because they decided that the reason Jesus didn't return is that we humans had become so disgusting and so sinful that he couldn't stand the idea of being in our presence again. Or another way to put it is that we failed to follow the gospel mandate. And so therefore we had to turn our life around if we were ever going to entice Jesus to come back. Well, this movement that quickly erupts from the ground up, all true reform begins from the ground up and from the inside out. It does not come from the top down. And they call this movement the Vita Apostolica, or the life of the apostle. And that's because all reform movements, even before the year 1000, always looked back to the early church. How did the first followers of Jesus in Jerusalem live? How did the first followers of Paul interpret and live out the gospel he was preaching? And so, guessing the best they could, they started imitating the life of the apostle, the Vita Apostolica, by living, sharing all goods in common, meeting together informally morning and evening for prayer. And these were many people who couldn't read or write. And it's really through Dominic that the idea of a rosary, which would have been a rope tied with knots, as a form of prayer, 150 knots for 150 psalms, became one of their forms of common prayer because they couldn't afford books that they could even read. That renewal movement all across Europe erupted. And so this is an era when several new religious life expressions erupted. It was the Knights Templar, Francis will come along, Dominic will come along, the Cistercians come along, the Camaldolese. Renewal movements within institutional religious orders were erupting. But at the same time, the common people out on the farm, at the market, the fishermen, felt that this was their movement too. And it becomes quite a disruption to business. We've always had the 1% and the 99% because they were abandoning their farms to follow preachers, to move into a community to live together. This was also a time when the economy itself was moving from a bartering economy to a coin economy, and a lot of people just got dropped through the cracks. When you change a major way of handling finances, now we've got cryptocurrency. Somebody gets dropped through the cracks. It's never smooth and it's never just. So there was a lot of turmoil going on in Europe. Good turmoil in terms of those who were trying to find a new way to follow the gospel because the old way, if they were following it at all, wasn't working very well. They were taking the time to listen to preachers who could read and write. And those were considered two separate skills. You might know how to read, but you wouldn't know how to write, or you might know how to write, but you didn't understand what you were scripting. But they were looking for people who could read and tell them the gospel stories, the prophets of the Old Testament, anything out of the Bible, and preach from that. And they were oftentimes informal preachers. They were not the ones approved of by the official church. And that caused consternation for the official church. But at the same time, this is a time when they're finally addressing corruption in the clergy, in the sense that you, as a guy in the village, you've learned some basic reading and writing, so you're technically literate, could go to a bishop and say, I'd like to become a priest, and they'd make this arrangement where he might get a little bit more training, but he'd be ordained a priest, and then the top 10% of the money he collected on Sunday would go to that bishop. It was called, one of the words was simony. At the same time, we had a married priesthood. I mean, it was at least an option with children. And parishes were expected to, of course, support his wife and children as well as himself. Cluny, founded more like about 900 as a form of Benedictine life, decided that the reason why the church was so corrupt was because of the wives. So if we force a divorce and we throw the women and children out and we declare her a whore and we declare the children bastards and enforce mandatory celibacy on the priesthood, all the problems will go away. A recent commentator on a certain station in the United States that I won't mention, about a month ago, made a declaration on his show that crime would go away if we just got rid of the women. That is Cluny all over again. And Cluny did a few good things, but mostly they caused trouble because this was not something that the church as a whole agreed upon. It was something that Cluny kind of enforced. And so we also have disruptions to families where the priests are now required to be celibate, whether they really were or not, but that was the requirement. The women were thrown out. There was also a problem with priests selling the sacred vessels of the altar to improve the profit line for the parish, or they were transferring the title to the church property to their children when it really belongs to the people of that parish, of course. But the Beguine movement is part of this apostolic vita apostolica that spread all across Europe, and it happened really all at once. And for the Beguines themselves, it happened right about 1200. And scholars say it really was everything from Spain, where they're known as Beatas, all the way into Eastern Europe and probably Russia. I, of course, don't read Russian, but more and more is coming out from scholars in Eastern Europe. They're translating their work into English, and so more people are becoming aware of the Beguine movement that happened there, but really all at once. And tired historians say, oh, well, the Beguine movement happened only because there weren't enough guys for the women to marry because they were all off at the Crusades, creating havoc all over the Mediterranean region. But the scholars again are saying, as they're crunching numbers, they're saying, no, that's actually not true. They became Beguines. They joined this movement that would become known as Beguine because they felt called to serve the gospel as they felt called to do so. And one of their greatest supporters were the powerful Benedictine abbesses. And it was not unusual for an abbess who had a lot of territory to give a portion of her land to the Beguines to establish a small Beguine community. She held the title so she could protect the Beguines if ever either the church or secular authorities went after the women. But they were, all throughout history, great supporters of the Beguines and their call to serve the gospel. They get known by many names, the colloquial names. So Beguine is kind of like an overarching title for this movement, and it's primarily applies to Northern Europe, so present-day Belgium, Holland, Northern France, Germany. That's where the word actual Beguine comes in. Beguinhof for Flemish, for the women there. But in other parts of the country, they're known as penitentia, bizoche, mantelate. It's just local colloquialism. But there was a guy by the name of Jacques de Vitry who left his teaching position at the University of Paris to go study with Marie Drouin and to study alongside the Beguines, this early movement. And he eventually gets made a bishop and then a cardinal. So he's traveling across Europe in his new roles, and he keeps writing. So he's a contemporary of them, 1200s. He says, Bezoche, penitentia, Beguine by another name, same lifestyle, same ministry, same call, just a different word, the colloquial word. They lived very diverse lifestyles. Majority, probably 60 or 70%, lived in groups of 2 or 3. As they found the money, they bought a house, and these houses, if you've ever been to Europe, are narrow and tall, so you have to have really good knees to get up to the top floor. I wouldn't make it at this point in my life, but they would try to buy a home that had 1 or 2 extra bedrooms. Now, they didn't have 1 person per bedroom, so the idea, for those of you who lived years ago, before Vatican II, lived in dormitories. Well, that concept comes from the Beguines, and it was a way to make room for either very poor women, but especially widows. Widows tended to find themselves homeless because when their adult children had to choose between feeding their children or mom, it was mom who lost out and she was thrown out on the street, and the Beguines would welcome them in. So one of their goals was always to have space where they could welcome in a number of widows to join them in their community. So that was kind of a significant ministry that they were known for. About 20% were these large court beguinages. So a beguine is the person, a beguinage is the home where they lived. And again, these were donated lands because the countesses really liked what the Beguines were doing and wanted to collaborate with them. So they would get this piece of land. It would always be along a canal because a canal was the highway of their day. So how do you ship goods in and ship goods out? It's on a boat. And so they would start building houses. Today, what we would, at least in the States, call townhouses, these tall, narrow, side by side by side, and they were slowly building an outer wall, which was their home, and circle the outer edge of the property. And it wasn't about hiding away from the world. This is not a cloister. This was about having space for their beekeeping, for their beer making. Of course, you always had to have beer. For being able to welcome people in, coming into the town to sell their wares at Saturday market. And socially, this was a very unsafe time. And so the gates would be open during the day. The people knew if they got there before dusk, they could come in with their sheep or their goats and their product and sleep in this open courtyard because the gate would be closed at dusk. And usually they hired guards to protect those gates because, they wanted to keep themselves and their guests safe. They usually built their own church within the beguinage and hired their own chaplain. They tended towards valuing either a Dominican or a Franciscan. Oddly enough, big paradox, Dominicans were behind the Inquisition, but Dominicans could be the greatest defenders of Beguines and their teachings and their visions and what they were doing. Very strange, but that's the way we humans are. And they met for morning and evening prayer. And then if Mass was available, because it wasn't always available in those days, and certainly at the court beguinages it would be, then they would also celebrate net Mass. Now, why they were called mumblers is because at least the earliest form of prayer for the Beguines involved pushing their chairs back and gathering in a circle, and they would start singing and dancing in kind of these intricate dance movements, and then there would be a lot of ecstatic prayer, what today we might call speaking in tongues. But they had this ecstatic prayer and this dancing and the singing that would go on for quite a while, would settle down, put their chairs back in, start praying the traditional, today we say liturgy of the hours, but whatever psalter they preferred, which would always include the Psalms, but then pray the more traditional office and then go off. Well, people would hear this from the street and say, oh God, they're just in there mumbling their heart away. But it was, for American context anyway, it'd be like the early Shakers or Quakers, and then some of our more fundamentalist evangelical traditions also have this tradition of Pentecostal, I guess we'd say, of praying in ecstatic forms of prayer. It was just how they felt called, and they took very much control over how their worship would be. Mass, of course, would look like Mass of their era, but everything else And they were great composers of poetry and of hymns, and I'm going to mention a few people. They were not nuns. They had no rule, no set rule across all beguinages. This is an area where young scholars are currently doing a lot of work as they are chasing down through diverse archives, state archives, trying to find these original rules. It would be like, 6 of us get together here in Glebe, and we decide we feel called to start this ministry, and we've decided, let's say that our primary work will be literacy. We're going to teach people to read and write and do their numbers enough so they can function well in business. And so then we sit down and we say, okay, so we're going to meet in the morning about 6 a.m. for morning prayer, and the Mass down the road at St. Sebastian's is at 11 o'clock on Sunday, so on Sunday we'll gather there, and in the evening let's pray at 6 o'clock, and we'll have a common meal at this time and this time, and of all the woolens or linens that we produce, the faulty stuff is what we'll make our clothes out of, and we'll save the other for selling and making a profit. And they had this thing called the Table of the Holy Ghost, and it really wasn't a table, but it was the fund that they collected. Every beguine committed a certain amount of money based on what she could earn to put into this pot that they used for feeding children, for caring for these widows, for funding their hospitals and hospices. It was part of their social service ministry that they had. And then there is a certain commonality. You go visit Paris and you say, hey, did you hear what they do on Christmas? This works great. And you're added into your rules. So before you know it, over time, some of the rules start taking on a certain similarity. It's just because, if something works great in your house, then I'm going to take it home and suggest we try that. Beguines were great businesswomen. And that is one of the pieces that historians really, of years past, overlook. And it's because they knew they needed to fund their own ministries. They did not want to be dependent upon a bishop's goodwill or bad will as to whether or not they'd find funding. And really, they couldn't even count on these noble women. They had great supporters up in the Bruges area, in parts of northern Italy. But oftentimes, most of the time, I would say, they were totally dependent on themselves to earn the money to fund the hospitals and the schools that they operated, and of course to support themselves. And so some of them wheeled and dealt in finances, extending lines of credit, doing coin exchange, selling annuities. One even managed to make it onto the bourse at Bruges, which was a major financial center in the 1300s. She was so successful that she had to be allowed on to kind of like the New York Stock Exchange or something. But their primary areas, I think, were in the north, woolens, everything from the raw fleece, carding it and spinning it and weaving it, and polishing, finishing the woolens. And because the guilds in the Low Countries resented how effective and efficient the Beguines were in this area, they ended up buying most of their fleece from England, who shipped it over. They did all of this, and then they sent back to England for sale and good money the finely polished, finished woolens. And then in their own area, they might also have women who come to them because they want fancy new capes and new dresses, and they would, make the dresses for these women. In Paris and in Germany, it was also silk making, from the silkworms all the way to final products. And of course, as a woman of a certain status, you had to have a silk purse with a string around your wrist and a bag underneath that showed that you were a woman of a certain prominence, and had that hanging off your wrist there. And once we had the printing press, in there would most likely be a book. They were these square, boxy things, kind of awkward for my hands to hold now, but it fit into that bag. So one, if they had free time, they could sit at the park and read, but it also said that, again, I'm a woman of a certain status because I've got a book in my bag. But these women, as I said, fed into that market. In the south of southern France and in Italy, it's going to be linen making. And so the faulty wool is what the women wore in the north, and the faulty linen in the south is what they wore and sold the best of their product. So they didn't have a habit, But as would happen with our apostolic sisters, they start wearing the attire of the widow. And so what a widow wore from one neighborhood to another might differ, which is why when they left Europe and came down here to Australia or over to America, there were different ways of pinning your veil and your coif depending on what neighborhood you came from. And so even the cover on The Wisdom of the Beguines was probably from Cambrai, which is still in modern day Belgium, was the way that the ladies folded and pinned their veil that showed a certain status. But and then oftentimes then they would have a hooded cape for going out into the colder weather. But the only thing that was distinguishing was that they didn't wear the fancier fabric that they could wear, and it wasn't dyed. So however the wool or the linen turned out is the color that their fabric was, whereas it could be dyed for a woman of a certain class who, I guess there was one color, like a certain shade of blue that only royalty were allowed to wear, but dyes would then be for women of a certain class. But they undercut the prices of the guild, who were padding prices, and so they tended to be very, very successful in this ministry. But it was also about giving job skills to women coming off the farms. Coming off the farms partly because of natural climate change, not what we're facing today, but scholars now tell us that there were a number of volcanic eruptions both in Korea and Indonesia of today that were like nuclear blasts, and 2 and 3 years of the heavy silt going around the planet caused farms to fail, like our Mount St. Helens in the neighborhood I come from. It lasted a few months, but it was nothing like what scholars say happened back in the 12, 13, 1400s, and then something about sunspots. So the uniqueness of climate change today is the fact that it's caused by humans, not by eruptions of volcanoes or anything. For the most part, it is that. The noble women of northern Italy and of the Low Countries knew that when the population was better educated, they made more money, and therefore taxes could be healthier. That's the way they explained it to their husbands and the other men, is your tax base will increase as these people gain access to education. So women coming off the farms, because the farms are failing, the weather is really weird, were in high danger of being trapped in prostitution as the only thing they could do to support themselves. So the Beguines were out looking, and they spread word amongst the housewives. You know, if you see a young girl coming in and it's pretty obvious she has no one and nowhere to go, to send her to us. And these girls would be invited to come in and live with the Beguines, and they'd learn one level of the production of either the linen or the silk or the wool. And so they would learn a skill, and then they'd be taught some basic reading and writing and numbers so that they could support themselves in whatever work they did. They were free to either leave, at a certain point when they were better established and had a skill that they could market, or sometimes they did choose to stay, at least for a while, in the Beguine community. Now, Beguines don't take lifelong vows. That was one of the ways they were distinguished from the Benedictines, who were known as the primitive observance, because it was, amongst other things, it was solemn vows for lifelong. Beguines, the only promise they made, and it was literally a promise, is that while they lived in the Beguinage, they would be chaste celibate. So no poverty. So there were wealthy Beguines and poor Beguines. The obedience really was only a matter of meeting every Friday night with the Beguine community to discuss the business of the coming week and, what are their needs and, any news from anywhere around the continent that might be of interest. They did meet about once a week for we Benedictines would probably say chapter, but it was kind of informal. But the only promise was that of remaining chaste. You could come with your children. It was one way that the church recognized getting rid of a husband you didn't want is to come join a beguinage, and your children are welcome to come along if they want to come or if they're still young. And so it was not unusual to see children within the beguinage, which could be the children of Beguines or it could be orphans. It was not unusual for them to welcome orphans into their midst, or the local neighborhood kids who are coming in for school lessons. And then you were free to leave anytime you wanted or needed to. And it could be want, but in those days you didn't marry for true love. That would be very, very rare. This is the era of the troubadours and all this great love poetry of Iseult and can't remember the other person's name, but all these great stories of passionate love, kind of, the Song of Songs brought up to the 12th century, 13th century, but people really didn't actually get married for love. It was economic or political or both. And so sometimes Beguines felt they needed to leave for a political marriage. Really, it was usually about protecting their adult children to make sure they received their inheritance. But if they felt that they needed to, because they maintained family connections. And so if they felt that they needed to marry for the benefit of the family, they were free to do so, and it was not considered at all shameful. When they did go out as Beguines to minister, they went out 2 by 2 to protect their reputation because, as I've told my students over and over again with a smile on my face, women are the source of all sexual sin, and men are not responsible for any of their misbehavior. And so to protect their reputation, because they did go out fairly freely, they would go out 2 by 2, which is what we Benedictines did for years, including right here in Australia and up in the United States. Never went out alone, went out with at least 2, at least with one other sister to protect our reputation. And they did go out for a couple of reasons, not just conducting business. They went out to preach. This was a time of interdict. The French king had his army, and the Pope had the sacraments. And so when the French king misbehaved, or the Holy Roman Emperor, the Pope might lay down the law, and interdict meant he was no mass, no burial of the dead in consecrated ground, no access to any sacraments. And even Hildegard of Bingen endured this, if you remember her story, for burying someone in her cemetery that the church decided should not have been buried there. They were not allowed to chant the office. They had to recite it softly. So that's interdict. And there would be literally years when there was no celebration of Mass and no burial of people in consecrated ground. And so when there was no Mass, the Beguines filled in the gap by going out to the street corners and meeting in those churches and doing their own preaching. They translated the scripture into their own local vernacular, probably not the whole Bible, but whatever it is they wanted to be able to teach from, and they would teach and preach where the priests were not allowed to do so. They would meet in the marketplace with these puppet shows. Now, puppets were not these cute little things. A friend of mine went to Czechoslovakia to study the art of the medieval puppet. Her puppets are about this big. I don't know what that would be in meters, but they're about 3 feet tall in American. We never did learn the centimeter thing. Learning disabled in that department. But these puppets were quite large, and they would put on puppet shows teaching Bible stories and entertaining people in the local marketplace. They did run hospitals and hospices. That term gets used interchangeably because they had some health care. I mean, it was true. Hildegard wrote a whole book on medicine, so they had some health care that they could extend. But it was also a hospice, a place to journey with people who were dying. But it was also a hospice was a place where the destitute poor could go. And they might not be there permanently, but usually they would be coming in pretty sick, starvation-related diseases, live in the hospice for a while, regain their health, and then the Beguines would figure out, the next step for their life. Are they going to stay in one of our homes? Are they able to go back to their family? Whatever it is. So the terms are kind of fluid at this time. But women being in hospital ministry really actually does date back to the Beguines, who set these up. And they had a very good reputation for the cleanliness and the care that they extended to people. And it was always without a fee. And so in Beguinages, there was the magistra. A magistra is the title for a leader. Now, that's the feminine. A magister is the guy who has completed his master's degree in theology, and you get this kind of funky-looking hat, and then you bore the title magister. Quickly, even though they couldn't go to university and didn't have any kind of degree, the leaders of Beguinages were referred to as magistra. And they might only serve 2 or 3 years. Each community decided how long you were elected for, and then if you could be reelected, and all that sort of thing. But the magistra had a lot of the one who was in charge of the hospital or hospice actually also managed all the donations that were brought in and administered the finances for the Beguine community. So she was not only caring for the sick and the destitute, but she was running also the finances for the community, because they never went out begging. That was one of the reasons why they developed a good reputation. But people would just automatically make donations to them for their hospital or hospice. And so she had to administer that, which means she had people out overseeing the farms and the business, whatever she invested in, to attend to those funds. Marie Duan becomes quickly the patron of Beguines, but she never claimed that title for herself. She actually lived at a time when the word was just beginning to emerge. But Marie Duan and her husband, again, one of these arranged marriages, decided quickly that they both wanted to serve the gospel and not live a traditional married life. And they moved out into the countryside to where some lepers were known to be dwelling. And they built a hut for each of the lepers in that area, plus one for each of them. They lived separately, and a chapel. And they actually literally formed a community living alongside the lepers, giving them a great sense of dignity and belonging. And the number of people who joined them really did increase, partly because of Marie's fame for her teaching and her quality of life, but also being impressed with the fact that they were willing to take on the context of a leper, which meant they too could not actually return to the city. You may know they had to, when they walked, they had a walking stick with a bell on it to make sure anyone knew that they were coming and that they were been classified as a leper. So they really were, ostracized from all of society. But she was much loved for that, and there's record of St. Francis of Assisi wanting to travel north to meet Marie Duan, but his health by then was getting pretty bad. Both Marie and Francis died of anorexia-related diseases. There is a book out called Holy Anorexia that you might be aware of, but a scholar traced all these stories from the desert on of people who, even though the church kept saying stop doing it, literally starved themselves to death in the belief that by only consuming the consecrated host, they could draw closer to God. Well, they sure did by passing to the other side. So don't follow that example, but Marie did end up dying of anorexia-related illness. She was really quite young, 33, 34. And that number may have some kind of meaning for people like that. We have surviving letters. Some of them were great letter writers. Hadwick and Mechtilde Magdeburg and Catherine of Siena. People don't realize Catherine is actually a Beguine. In her neighborhood in the city of Siena, they were called mantelates, and it was a reference to a black woolen wrap they would wear around their shoulders when they go out. And it's only about 200 years later, when the Dominicans and the Franciscans are fighting over prominence in the church, that all of a sudden they go back in history and they start claiming some of these women as they would call them Dominican tertiaries or Franciscan tertiary. That's a word they made up later on and went back in history to claim these women as their own, as proof of why the Dominican way is better or why the Franciscan way is better. What is true is that someone like Angela of Foligno, Penitentia, or of Catherine of Siena, is that they tended to favor, in Catherine's case, the Dominican church in town and therefore the Dominican preachers. But women were not welcome into the Dominican order. They just literally were not until probably the mid-1300s. Or Angela Foligno, she was an early follower of Francis and his followers, but not joining because they weren't welcome. They just were not welcome. But they claimed Francis's charism or Dominic's charism, and so later on they get wrapped up into that movement. But Angela Foligno, actually Clare of Assisi, wanted to go out and follow Francis and his guys and preach the gospel to the four corners of the earth. but unfortunately she was from a very powerful family who was scandalized by that idea, and they threw her behind a grill with some of her companions, and that's the genesis of the Poor Clare movement, but it was not what she wanted. She was a penitentiary, and she did try for several years to live that life until she lost the family fight and ended up behind that grill and made the best of her desert. You know, I imagine behind that grill that was her desert, both because she didn't want to be there, but because they tried to embrace lady poverty, which was not hard to do behind that grill, because they couldn't get out and they did not have control of their own money anymore. But we have letters from these people. Mechthild talks about writing 7 books. Mechthild of Magdeburg, who's probably one of the best known commonly of the Beguines, but we know it as one book. It's just that they didn't have a concept of sitting down and creating an outline and writing this whole book and editing it and re-editing it and then publishing it. It's just she would send these pamphlets out to people to share with their beguinages. Mechthild was the magistra of her community in Magdeburg. In her later years, as her health is beginning to fail, and the Inquisition is after her because she was condemning corruption amongst the clergy. She referred to them as smelly goats. She ended up going to Helfta, which is a Benedictine monastery of quite renown of its own, and she spent her last years there with them, partly because of her poor health, partly because she was going blind. But she wrapped up the second half of her 6th book and her 7th book, The Flowing Light of the Godhead, which is a series of poems. It's letters of encouragement, letters of condemnation, visions that she's had, teachings so it's a kind of a mishmash, but a lovely mishmash of her writings over the years. So you kind of get a sense of her progression in her inner world as a woman of that time. We have letters from really quite a number of people. Hadewig of Brabant was a Beguine in the Flemish countries. We don't know exactly when she was born or when she died, but she left behind a large body of poetry and some letters. We don't think she was a magistra because we think she traveled around some. And that was not unusual. You might still be a member of this particular Beguine community, but that doesn't mean you didn't go out with a pair and go on kind of a preaching tour. But we think that Hadewig was born into aristocracy, that she grew up in a court, because she had a real familiarity with courtly love poetry, and it's not something most people today would really latch onto and say this is, very enlightening, but it was of its era. I guess today they'd be rapping or something like that, hip hop, as their form of expressing their teachings. But she's considered to be one of the best writers of courtly love poetry of her era, and she wrote in Middle Dutch. Again, kind of unusual. They know she knew Latin, the Church Ecclesia Latin, but she wrote in Middle Dutch because she was trying to reach a larger audience. And so if you're into poetry, she would be someone you might want to look up and read some of her writings there. We have a Beguine by the name of Marguerite Porret. She wrote a book called Mirror of Simple Souls. Marguerite will end up being burned at the stake in 1310. But it wasn't just about her. She was in prison for a couple of years because she wrote this book. Again, this is a progression. It was burned publicly by the bishop in Cambrai. She already had another copy. She added some more chapters, was spreading it around to people. We know this because copies showed up in archives all over Europe in different languages. So she was quite popular in her day. Again, it was burned. She was ordered never to talk about it or to to share copies. She added on some more to it. She kept preaching around Europe. She gets swept up into the French king's jail. She refused, in the 2 years she was down in his jail, to respond to any of his jailers, claiming that she was a citizen of the Holy Roman Empire and only the emperor could question her for whether she was a heretic or not. Only he had the right to put her on trial. She refused to acknowledge the authority of the French king. So she's down there for 2 years. She's refusing to answer their questions about her book, whether it's heretical or not, why she taught this, why she taught that. But then one day the French king gets upset with the Templars who are down in the south because he wants their money and they won't give it up to him. The Jews won't turn over all their wealth to him. He obviously was conducting wars he couldn't afford. So he just basically orders the whole prison to be emptied out, and everyone was executed May 1st, 1310, and she gets swept up into that. Now, why is her book controversial? She said, like the others, they're quite pastoral. All of these women whose writings survived really pay attention to what does it mean to grow in spirituality? What does it mean to deepen your inner life? What does it mean to expand your prayer life? Who is God? What are healthy images for God? It's not just God the Father. There's all these other wonderful images that Beguines use, as that Marguerite did. So hers, like the others, are writing very pastorally. This is how I pray. This is how I deepen. This is what I've come to understand about who God is. But she goes a little bit farther because she says it is possible to become so close to God that you don't need the church's sacraments anymore. Well, that is what they objected to, because sacraments are big business, and I control them as the Pope, the bishop, the whatever. I control them. I decide who gets access and who does not. And you've just gone and said, we're not needed. Well, she's not really denigrating sacraments. That's where they misread. She's just saying it is possible for a person to draw so close to God that the sacraments are kind of meaningless now. And that was what they hauled her in for an investigation for heresy. Interesting side note, her book continues to spread after she dies, but her name falls off the title page, if there's a title page. And it's written by, they start saying it was written by an anonymous man. And for several hundred years, it was quite the hit. And then, like anything with the Enlightenment, it kind of gets put to the back of the library and is forgotten. And it is only in 1946 that an Italian woman scholar proves once and for all that the book they said was perfectly fine, written by this anonymous male, was actually the book that Marguerite Porete died for. She finally got resurrected and brought back into the fold. Like Catherine of Siena wrote a book called The Dialogue. Mechtilde Magdeburg has portions that are dialogue. There are a number of others. I don't have to go through the whole list. But they would write a dialogue. Like for Marguerite, it was three people, the reason, the soul, and the spirit. For some of the others, like Catherine of Siena, it's the soul and God having a conversation with each other. Now, it was not meant to be read in private. It was not meant for you to sit in a corner with a good cup of tea and start reading this dialogue. It'd be pretty dry. It's kind of like, I hate to say this, try reading Shakespeare today. You're meant to witness Shakespeare being performed on a stage, not sit there and read the pages. My apologies to all the English professors who teach Shakespeare, but the dialogues were meant to be performed. And so she writes this dialogue, let's just say Catherine of Siena writes this dialogue, but she and another woman, or just two women, would take each of the parts in the marketplace and start performing this back and forth, having this conversation as a way of teaching the people. Again, that's always the goal, never be to be read just in private. That's a very modern concept. As you know, in the Rule of Benedict, when Benedict says, when you're reading, when you're doing your Lectio, don't disturb your neighbors. It's not because you might hit the table or, drop a cup of tea. It's because people read orally. And so Benedict wanted you to read, but soften it down so you're not disturbing your neighbor who might be reading something different. That was true during the season of the Beguines. We're still reading orally. It really is only a very modern concept, like maybe the later 1700s, 1800s, when people started reading in private. Probably with the increase of philosophy and novels, but it's not during this time. It would have been done orally. And let me see here. Catherine of Siena has a great saying, and it's a saying that you sometimes see in a different form on, at least in the United States, on greeting cards and that sort of thing. And what she says is, "Be who God meant you to be, and you will set the whole world on fire." I think that's so lovely. Catherine, as you may know, reached a certain point where she started going on preaching ministries. She began by walking to Avignon in southern France and somehow made it into the papal court. Of course, you can't do this today, but then I guess it was more fluid. And she went into the papal court and she found the Pope on his throne, and she told him she'd had a dream. And, Your Holiness, you either return to Rome or you're going to burn in hell forever. And something about her, he packed up and he returned to Rome. There's certain forcefulness of her personality and a certain integrity to her words convinced clerics that when she spoke to them, she meant what she said. Now, several times he was inching towards returning to France under the control and protection of the French king. And each time she traveled down to Rome and she would convince the Pope, no, you've got to stay. Now, hell is very real. And you know your Dante Alighieri and the Divine Comedy. And that's a great book if you haven't read it. So you've got kings and bishops and popes burning in the deepest depths of hell, and it's levels of hell down to the worst. And then you have purgatory with people who are going to pass through eventually to the other side. And by God in heaven, Dante placed prostitutes and courtesans up in heaven because they were basically known for being more generous to the poor than other people were, because they know what it's like to be there. And so this was rich in the imagination of the people at this time. So when the Beguines talked about hell or purgatory in their visions, and visions were always meant to be preached and taught, people actually literally believed them because they did live with the fear of hell. And when there was interdict, Hildegard was not the only one who buried people in consecrated ground. The Beguines became known as funeral specialists. And it's kind of like death doulas or hospices today, where a person would reach out to the Beguines and two would agree to accompany this person by sitting with them in their last days, praying with them, making sure they get water, whatever. When the person passes, they've promised they're going to follow you all the way to consecrated ground. So they wash the body, wrap it in a shroud. Coffins were mostly just for temporary use. They would accompany, pray the office of the dead, accompany the coffin to consecrated ground, even though technically they're not supposed to be burying anyone there. They would always find some place and would see that the body was properly buried in consecrated ground and buried, covered over, because they lived with a belief in those days that if you died and were buried in unconsecrated ground, you would burn in hell forever. It did not matter how holy your life was, how good a person you were. They truly believed that you had to be buried in consecrated ground in order to go to heaven, which I hope we have truly gotten over. But anyway, funeral specialists, and they were theologians of purgatory. And there's several of them, Lutgard and a few others, who had very vivid descriptions of who they saw in hell and who they saw in purgatory. And they would decide that, the fishmonger's wife was a good woman. She just made a few mistakes. And so, this is what they'd see people. So I started praying for Marguerite, let's say, to move out of purgatory into heaven. I watched her go through, and I watched her enter the pearly gates, and she's all fine now. Now, scholars tell us that we lost our imagination with the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, that people before the Enlightenment had a great capacity to see what we don't see today. And Carl Jung, in some ways, the psychologist, was trying through his dream work to help us tap in again to that reality that our rational brain decided simply did not exist. I think our prophets do that for us today when they challenge us to see what was right in front of our face and we just didn't see it, just didn't notice it. I think also this new science, which isn't new. Every time I say that, I could see my father rolling in his grave with laughter, because the new science began in about 1880. But with these wonderful, the Hubble telescope and the Webb telescope, seeing things in space that we knew didn't exist, and then here it is. You probably heard about 10 or so years ago, scientists said, we finally found a black hole. For some reason, they're really obsessed with finding black holes. And the pictures are taken. Well, then the computer downloads them, and then they start going in. And all of a sudden, there's like 100 galaxies in this black hole. Just because we couldn't see it didn't mean it wasn't there. And so we need to bring that kind of an attitude to reading some of these women, that they could see a reality that we couldn't see. This is not a talk about the theology of purgatory or anything like that. Really, Thomas Aquinas and Teresa of Avila and others taught that really, if there's purgatory at all, which is removing the last vestiges of sin, it's like this, like a snap of a finger, and you go to the other side. The Beguines, just with Dante's influence, kind of just saw, you might end up spending, years in purgatory, but, eventually you'll make it to the other side. Different theologies. But it was very, very vivid for them, and it was very important to people to have a Beguine journey with them to death and to the cemetery to make sure that they would get a good shot at going to heaven. As I mentioned before, they translated Scripture into the vernacular long before it became the hot topic that was part of Luther's movement to bring reform to the church, which of course was desperately needed. None of their translations were officially recognized because, as you know, women are not smart enough to translate the Bible into anything. In fact, the worst sin you could commit as a Beguine, what would get you in the most trouble, I don't know what their obsession was, but it was around theology of the Holy Trinity. Why that one piece of theology really irked them when any Beguine began to teach her understanding of the Trinity. They were very Trinitarian, but they also saw God as one. They were very comfortable with moving between these different images for who God is and how we can experience, because they're all images. Someone with a mind not like mine, two people, they wrote a book called Wisdom's Feast. And what they had done is they'd gone through the Bible from Genesis all the way to Revelation, and they recorded every image for God they could find, and it was something like 360. So to say there's only one way to image God is kind of silly, because even if you're a Bible fundamentalist, you ought to notice what's between the beginning and the end, all these images for who God is. And Beguines were very comfortable with teaching different images for God, and they were, generally speaking, very positive ones, because they lived in a day when people denigrated the value of the human body. The Beguines were a major influence on this concept of the real presence in the Eucharist. Thomas Aquinas was given the question, is the proper word transubstantiation or consubstantiation? And he debates back and forth in letters and this sort of thing. And he said, I really think transubstantiation is the word, but consubstantiation isn't bad. Just as a footnote, Luther will go with consubstantiation. So our Lutheran neighbors will say that it is the real presence during the actual church service, but they don't have a concept of it still being the Christ after the church service, whereas Catholics say once transubstantiation has happened, it is always Christ, and that's why we have the tabernacle where the unconsumed hosts are kept. And they had several reasons for this. They were in an era when people were so disengaged with what was going up at the altar, usually because the priest didn't understand ecclesial Latin, so he wasn't pronouncing it properly. They didn't understand Latin, so they didn't know what he was saying. And so what they would do is they'd bring in their beads, and they'd walk around the outer edge of the chapel, and they'd pray in front of their favorite pictures and statues while Mass is going on, and then walk out. They didn't even go forward to receive communion because they were so disengaged. But the idea of being in church at the same time of Mass seemed to have some meaning for them. And the Beguines are saying, oh my God, pay attention to what is going on up here. That's why the church picked up the tradition of ringing the bell before Vatican II and probably afterwards for a while, when the words of actual consecration were happening, so that if people were half asleep before then, they'd wake up and notice this is now the big moment. But the Beguines would almost dramatically, like actresses, act out this awareness of Christ is now present up on the altar. Everyone pay attention. And they would pressure the priest to hold the host up longer than normal because they wanted people to have time to gaze upon Christ. Why? Obviously, internally, they felt a real draw to the real presence in the Eucharist, but they were also rejecting the disvaluing of human life, that using guys as cannon fodder for going over to trying to liberate the Holy Land from the Muslims, who actually had a very high tolerance for different faith traditions. They were great protectors of the holy sites and allowed Christians in unhindered, actually protected them while they came on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. It's the Christians in this day who were so terribly violent towards everyone, including each other. They slaughtered each other on the way to Jerusalem and on the way back. The crusade, we have no right to blame at one level what's going on with Islamic terrorists right at the moment, because they're doing exactly what we did 800 years ago, or however long ago it was. So they're rejecting war. They're rejecting the lack of valuing of human life, and especially of women's bodies. They actually, midwives developed what we would today call forceps. They worked with silversmiths, and they created a device for when the baby is stuck in the birth canal to use that to help entice the baby out. And the church ruled that they are to destroy all those forceps because a woman must risk death because of Eve. And the Beguines are saying, oh, I don't think so. And they're rejecting this, and they're rejecting, obviously, the poverty that they were willing to let most people live in so that they can live their cushy lifestyle. So that is all connected today, what we would call social justice, to why they felt people needed to re-engage and understand the value of the real presence of Christ. Because if God was willing to become human, the human body must have some value. And so that was one of their main focuses. And there's a Beguine by the name of Juliana of Montcorleone. She had this vision, a series of visions, related to the real presence in the Eucharist. And it was that she kept seeing a host that had a slight tear in it and blood coming out. Now, this is just a vision, not a reality, but for her, very real. And she came to understand that was Jesus feeling that he was being broken and bleeding again because of people's lack of awareness of his presence in the consecrated host. So she calls this the Feast of Corpus Christi, or Corpus Christi, the Feast of the Body and Blood of Christ, I think is the name we give it today. So she spent some years traveling around Europe with a companion, staying at other begging communities and preaching her vision and preaching Corpus Christi. But as church history happens, a bishop decides that yes, it's valid. Yes, we need to have this feast. He orders that this one particular Sunday will be Corpus Christi Sunday, and then it spreads to other dioceses around the church. And if you read church histories today, they will still say that this bishop is the one who began the Feast of Corpus Christi, and Juliana, who preached it for years and was ignored for many years, she's not even mentioned. Women's history and contributions being silenced yet again. Beguines illuminated manuscripts. Beguines copied manuscripts before, of course, the printing press. And then in the early days of the printing press, you would print and then illuminate for wealthier customers, portions of it so it looks, really pretty. They had major influence on art history. And I'm no art historian, but I ran across a series of articles by women. And one of the things they found, there's an art piece called a Pieta, and Michelangelo has a famous one of a very young, polished Mary, and it's holding the crucified body of Christ in her lap. There's a lot of them that come out of Northern Europe, and they're a very distinctive style. And what art historians have figured out is that Beguines commissioned Pietas, but they would talk with the artists and say how they wanted Mary, how they wanted she to look, how Jesus was to be laid out across her lap. So there's these distinctive, different surviving statues. They're usually smaller because they usually were in the chapel of the Beguinage that the Beguines had a devotion to. We know that a lot of the psalters that have survived from Beguine communities, not in addition to the 150 psalms, maybe some of their favorite pieces of scripture, they would also add their own poetry that they composed or their own hymns that they composed. So basically what I would want you to come away with is to realize that the Beguines had a huge impact on literary and artistic and politics of Western Europe as the church developed and grew. They just simply do not get recognized for this. And if you're interested in finding out more about the Beguines, Wisdom of the Beguines, the book that that I wrote at the request of a gentleman from Freiburg who could not believe that Americans had no idea who the Beguines were, because it's so well known in Europe, is probably a fairly easy read to give you an introduction to the Beguines. And then there's a bibliography in the back where if you would like to study more, if you want to follow one particular Beguine or a region or some aspect of their contribution, you can pursue some of those books. They're all English because I don't have a command. I lost that years ago. I don't have a command of other languages. And really it's not helpful for the people that I intended the book for, which is the non-specialist. But there is a lot that you can learn, and the good news is young women are, especially women, but some guys are still digging up the history of Beguines and telling their story. So, you know, at some point my book already is out of date because there's so much more that has come out there, but it's very specialized. So thank you for your time, and hope you follow up on the Beguines.
Can ever give